Hello, everyone, and welcome to one of our two Willa Cather Foundation-sponsored panels, Willa Cather and Her Readers. My name is Kelsey Squire, and I'm an associate professor of English at Ohio Dominican University in Columbus, Ohio, and I'm the chair of this panel. For this panel, we invited our panelists to share their research on Willa Cather and her readers. Panelists were encouraged to consider the use of new archives and digital technologies to shed light on Cather's readers, tensions between middlebrow and highbrow readers in Cather's reception among diverse populations in terms of gender, race, sexuality, economic status, or nationality, and Cather's relevance to 21st century readers. So we have three papers for you today. Our first is by William Gonch, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland, College Park. He is also a visiting scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary, as well as the Director of Programs and Development at the Scala Foundation in Princeton, New Jersey. The title of his paper today is Anthropology and Escapism, Willa Cather and Zora Neale Hurston. Gonch suggests that by reading Cather and Hurston side by side, we are better able to understand the reception of their works in relation to larger cultural forces. Specifically, Gonch argues that Cather and Hurston develop strategies for representing marginal cultural actors, not as objects of knowledge, but as subjects who produce knowledge that often went unnoticed. Our second paper is by Matthew Hitchman, who recently received his PhD in Literature and Culture from the University of Washington. The title of his paper today is Bringing Readers to Regionalism, Willa Cather's Reworking of Alexander's Bridge into Alexandria's Plains. Through a comparative study of Cather's early novels, Alexander's Bridge and O Pioneers, Hitchman examines how Cather repackaged ideas from maritime fiction as a strategy for drawing her readers into seemingly regional writing. As Hitchman explains, however, Cather's use of this strategy brings Cather's work into association with U.S. imperialism and colonialism. Our last paper is by Barbara Tetenbaum, who is currently a visiting professor in the art department at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. The title of her paper is My Ántonia at 6 Pages a Day, the Slow Read Project. As her title suggests, Tetenbaum uses her paper to describe the slow read, a public literary art project to honor the 100-year anniversary of Willa Cather's novel, My Ántonia. Her paper, and the Slow Read Project, encourages us to consider the value of slow, communal reading and how these practices alter our conceptions of the novel. I was lucky enough to view an installment of the Slow Read Project in Red Cloud, Nebraska in 2018, and I really hope that you enjoy hearing about this project. So now I'll transition to the recordings of the individual papers. And while we missed being able to have an interactive conversation with the ALA audience, I'm going to provide a brief concluding reflection. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bill Gonch. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Maryland, College Park. Very excited to be joining you today. I want to thank Kelsey Squire for putting this panel together, for inviting me to be on it, and for all of the work that she does for the Cather community. Also want to thank Matthew and Barb for sharing this space with me, and you all for coming and seeing what we have to say. Today we're talking about Cather and her readers, and my way in is a little bit indirect through something I noticed about the reception histories of Willa Cather and Zora Neale Hurston, namely a number of similarities between them. Both of them have a kind of sine wave to their reputations. They experienced periods of success, Cather starting in the 1910s and Hurston a little later in the 1920s. Both experienced critiques in the 1930s, especially from a rising generation of younger male writers that led to declines in their reputation. Hurston famously entirely fell out of print by the time of her death in 1960. In both cases, these writers' reputations were recovered in the 1970s as a new generation, especially of feminist critics, drew new attention to their contributions and importance. But beyond the shared sine wave structure of interest in Cather and Hurston, I noticed that there are a series of shared terms in the critical conversation around them, both the critiques and the recovery. And that's what I want to look at today. I'm going to argue that at a moment when Western intellectual discourses, anthropology, modernist aesthetics, and Marxism among them, contributed to the critical study of cultures imagined as folk or past and the way that those studies were understood, Hurston and Cather called some of those discourses into question. Post-critical, long before the term existed, Cather and Hurston imagined early 20th century criticism as a self-protective exercise of power and both write humbler and more vulnerable engagements with the peoples they depict. Most of you are familiar with the charges of escapism, idealizing simplification, and romanticization that critics made against Cather, starting with H.L. Mencken's review of One of Ours in the early 20s and gathering steam in the 1930s. Cather, of course, famously championed a version of escapism in her 1936 essay. But the argument about escapism is less about whether one should escape reality and more about whose reality counts and how it's defined. Take one major critique of Cather, Granville Hicks's 1934 essay, The Case Against Willa Cather, as an example. For Hicks, all of Cather's novels depend on a mystical conception of the frontier and, quote, look back longingly to the heroism of earlier days. In Plain's novels like My Ántonia, she satisfies her desire for romantic idealism by depicting a moment in real history, that first European settlement of the Nebraska prairie. But that moment passed, and she felt only despair at her inability to find heroism in the urban and commercial present. In compensation, she wrote historical novels set in deeply Catholic cultures, Death Comes for the Archbishop, Shadows on the Rock, which indulge a longing for heroism, her admiration for natural beauty, her longing intensified by preoccupation with doubt and despair for the security of an unquestioned faith. Those are Hicks's words again. In this reading, Cather begins her career idealizing the heroism of the pioneers and finding the pioneers inevitably past. After novels that attempt to mourn its passing, like A Lost Lady, Cather turns to Catholic cultures from long ago for a true escapism, where she can find the heroic virtue that's tragically lacking in America's present. So this reading essentially entails Cather's attempt to dodge solving the questions of the present by turning further into the past. Weird thing about this is that the charge of representing cultures as past is also an escape into a kind of timelessness, the sense of stasis found supposedly in the Catholic cultures of New Mexico or of Quebec. And Hurston's critics in the 1930s make the same charge in almost the same terms. Richard Wright, Hurston's most famous adversary, charges that Hurston's work is restricted to a timeless pastoral depiction of African American life. Quote, her characters eat and laugh and cry and work and kill. They swing like a pendulum eternally in that safe and narrow orbit in which America likes to see the Negro live, between laughter and tears. Hurston fails on this reading to depict the social order of which her characters are a part, or the oppressions that confine their lives. Like Cather, supposedly turning her eyes away from historical context to enjoy a pure, timeless folk culture. Leanne Duck has argued that Harlem Renaissance critics saw Black folklore as part of, quote, the deep resources of the past. However valuable it might be as a psychological resource, it exists only, quote, in history and the realm of the aesthetic, not in, quote, the present and in the social space of the southeastern United States, end quote. In other words, migration and urbanization are transforming African American culture, but instead of taking on those social challenges, Hurston flees into a near mythic, rural, all-Black town. This probably sounds similar after rehearsing the Cather critics. Both bodies of critics accuse these authors of essentializing a timeless culture that is somehow past and timeless at the same time. This charge of timelessness is connected to both writers' interest in the then rising discipline of anthropology. Hurston was a professional ethnographer who studied in the doctoral program under Franz Boas, the Dean of American Anthropology at Columbia University. Eric Aronoff has described Cather's interest in anthropology, which she encountered in the New York intellectual and literary scene through little magazines in the 1920s. Aronoff has also articulated interesting connections between anthropology and modernist form. He cites anthropologist Edward Sapir's seminal 1924 essay, Culture, Genuine and Spurious, in which Sapir argues that a people's beliefs and practices express an underlying unity or authenticity, their culture, and proposes that scholars can only understand any particular belief or practice in light of its role as part of that abstract spatial whole. As Aronoff writes, it's only by seeing, quote, the integration of a culture's various elements that, quote, any one element, be it a religious practice, a grammatical structure, or a moral value, could be understood. Aronoff has shown that classical anthropology's concept of culture emerges in those little magazines in which Cather encountered it as part of a larger conversation that also develops modernist accounts of spatialized poetic form. Indeed, these are analogous concepts. Both poetry and culture is imagined in these conversations as an abstract whole object in space rather than in time. Culture was, for Sapir and others, timeless. On this account, cultures, as I say, are inherently timeless, and studying them promises the same pleasures as, quote, escapist literature. But where folk cultures were genuine, according to Sapir, urban industrialized culture was spurious because of its lack of a unifying spatial form. It's changing too much, and it's internally too chaotic. By the 1930s, however, with the Great Depression, the political valence of these charges had flipped. For many Marxist critics, including Hicks and Wright, the change associated with modern urban culture made it the engine of history. These critics argued the historical ages of centers out of which the future develops and peripheries which are stuck in amber, which are past and also timeless. Intellectuals must see which elements of an age are central and attend to that and dismiss the periphery. In the 1930s, the future and hence real history ran through the urban core, which is why these critics can only imagine an artistic project dedicated to rural folk communities as an attempt to escape into the past. When Cather and Hurston choose to represent people outside of the core, it appears to them as escapism. So now I want to spend a little bit of time looking at very condensed readings from both writers to see how they engage with this Marxist and anthropological style of reading. Zora Neale Hurston's 1935 ethnography, Mules and Men, functions as an allegory, I think, for the relationship between an anthropological intellectual and the culture that she strives to represent. It features as a protagonist Hurston herself, who must learn to become a part of her subject's culture and in particular to share her subject's vulnerability in order to represent it. It narrates a surrender of the superiority and protection offered by her distancing, comprehending intellect and the intellectual tools that give it that distance. By allowing herself to become vulnerable to the Black storytellers of Polk County, Florida, Hurston becomes a participant in their culture and able to represent it on its own terms. Hurston begins her search for folk tales in her hometown of Eatonville, Florida, because, quote, I knew that the town was full of material and that I could get it without hurt, harm, or danger, end quote. However, to get the best folk tales, she finds she has to travel to Polk County, deep in the Florida swamps, where violence is always close to the surface. Hurston represents the relationship between Polk County laborers and the law with the story of her first friend, Babe Hill, who murdered her husband and went on the lam. She was eventually caught and lodged in the Bartow jail, but, quote, After a few months, she had been allowed to come home, and the case was forgotten. Hurston tells us two things in this scene. First, in this world, women are as strong and dangerous as men. And second, the law offers no protection against violence for the culture that Hurston is joining. The law comes from outside the community and kills with as much arbitrariness as any individual. Individuals are vulnerable before the law's caprice and before violence from other individuals. One relies only on one's courage and one's friends. Hurston finds that she struggles to earn the trust of the laborers who tell the stories she wants to collect, because her money and education entitle her to protection that the rest of the county doesn't enjoy. Seeing a strange woman drive into town wearing, quote, a 1274 dress from Macy's, the laborers assume that she, quote, must be a revenue officer or a detective. To gain their trust, she pretends to be a bootlegger on the run from the law, which explains her car and her expensive dress. Hurston's cover earns her acceptance from Polk County, but it's a strange mask. It doesn't protect her. Actually, it makes her vulnerable to violence. She had protection when she was thought to be a detective, someone who works for the government. No one would risk stabbing a government, and people might hesitate to stab or otherwise attack what she actually was, a scholar from the North. But if she's just a bootlegger, then if she crosses somebody, she is subject to the same danger that everyone else shares. And this is really pointed out by a moment later in which Hurston, once she's been accepted by the community, essentially tells everyone that the whole bootlegging story was a cover, and everyone continues to accept her. Once she is accepted her susceptibility to the same danger that her subjects share, she's one of them. The text then goes on to record stories told by Polk County laborers. Hurston dramatizes the act of telling each tale, and I'm going to skip forward a little bit in the interest of time, but what I want us to point out is that these tales are live, embodied, dramatic performances that change every time. Hurston uses a number of literary strategies to record this as a creative culture in flux, responsive to historical changes and to the present moment. These are not abstract stories recorded in the way that, say, the Brothers Grimm record stories. She records these stories in storytelling scenes and depicts their new creation. And in depicting this culture also, she depicts the violence that she exposes herself to. So for example, one night, her friend Big Sweet warns her that a woman named Lucy means to stab Hurston at a party. And when Hurston, worried, thinks she should skip the party, Big Sweet insists she go because, quote, you came here to see and listen, and I mean for you to do it. This is a culture that can't be abstracted away, as Big Sweet knows. Seeing and listening can only be done by someone who's a part of it, who fully accepts the risks of being a part of it. It can't be done while retaining a kind of buffer between oneself and the culture. Those risks do arrive, and in fact, this is the end of the text, in which Hurston goes to the party, is threatened, and her friends help her escape. So there are two things I want to emphasize here. First, that Hurston rejects the notion that the culture of Polk County as an abstract essence that she, as an anthropologist, can know. She's not here to turn the culture into a text. She insists instead that it's in the midst of historical change, that it's just as present as any urban culture. And second, she insists that it can't be understood except by becoming a part of it and sharing its danger. Willa Cather's The Professor's House gives us, I would argue, a photo-negative image of Hurston's argument. It offers a critical modern center of consciousness who fails to understand a marginalized culture because of his conviction that his intellectual tools, premised on his separation from that culture and his ability to express its essence, enable him to understand it. In other words, Hurston and Cather are making essentially the same argument, but Hurston makes it through a protagonist who accepts a vulnerable, engaged position And Cather makes it by depicting the failure of Godfrey St. Peter, a failure that is tied to his self-isolation and his intellectual pride. The culture in Cather's case is the housekeeper Augusta's immigrant Catholicism. Godfrey St. Peter, as I'm sure you all know, is a learned agnostic and historian of the Spanish imperial explorers. In a lecture, he imagines religion as a source of lost authenticity, and think back to Sapir's sense of genuine cultures as being a source of authenticity. He downplays science, which has provided ingenious toys but reduced the moral significance of our actions, because for him, humans were happier when every minor act could have, quote, the magnificence of a sin. Every act had meaning and every life matters, which he thinks is what people want and care about. Religion, in other words, becomes a source of a kind of aesthetic value to one's life. What matters is not any particular doctrine or practice of religion, but its ability to undergird a sense of meaning. He concludes, quote, art and religion, they are the same thing in the end, have given man the only happiness he has ever had, and he mourns the loss of that meaning. Religion then, for St. Peter, is a kind of spatialized form. He then goes on, in fact, to make some connections that I believe Cather must have recognized as references to modernism. He offers a kind of secularizing rereading of the Bible in which Moses learned, quote, the importance not of any biblical God, but of the human need to render ordinary actions meaningful. And then the Christian theologians who followed him are modernist poet editors like Ezra Pound, who, quote, went over the books of the law like great artists, getting splendid effects by excision. They reduced the law to its tragic essence, throwing all the light upon a few sins. And with this change came a host of cathedral builders, sculptors, and others. St. Peter's speech then snatches cultural fragments and reforms them in a way reminiscent of something like the Wasteland. It secularizes those meanings, representing Jewish and Christian traditions as interested not in the truth of their claims, but in the psychological meanings embedded in those claims. It proposes spiritual meanings that replace literal ones, to repurpose aspects of a religious tradition to new ends. And as we see when St. Peter later talks to Augusta, he gets it all wrong. Despite her lack of education, Augusta frequently reveals St. Peter's ignorance of religious matters. For example, shortly after the speech I discussed, St. Peter confuses the text of the Litany of Loretto with that of the Magnificat. The first, the Litany, is a popular, relatively modern devotional text. The second is a passage from the Gospel of St. Luke that's used in the Catholic Church's daily prayers. The professor's mistake is elementary and indicates a really fundamental ignorance of the belief and practice of Catholicism, the very belief and practice that he had been using as his poetic text and that he had been expostulating on. Because he speaks from a position of intellectual and professional power, he feels permitted to reinterpret religious practices, to provide a hegemonic account of them without bothering about their details. In fact, his ignorance enables his reinterpretations. A more faithful account could not have achieved the striking poetic compression of his fanciful history. In large ways and small, the pairing of Augusta and St. Peter dramatizes intellectual interpretation as an act of power, the very act of power that Hurston, in her very different way, was also critical of. And the very act of power, I would argue, that both Cather's and Hurston's critics were engaged in. So, to conclude for now, I'd like to note just a few of these overall similarities between Cather and Hurston. A few convergences. First, both writers are interested in anthropology's power to represent marginalized cultures, but that interest is balanced with a skepticism about anthropology's power and about New York intellectuals' power to say what cultures are and mean. Both are interested in the art forms and cultural practices of marginalized people. Think of Cather's interest in the pottery of Native Americans or the culture of French Canada. And both crucially treat those forms of life and art as living things, as growing and changing, not as static in the way that they tended to be imagined in the 1920s. Both writers are more attuned than many of their contemporaries to the contributions of non-central peoples to historical change and to the modern world. This conviction of the importance of marginalized people and arts led to both writers' dismissal, I believe. And I also think there's more to be found here. I think the stories of each writer's dismissal and recovery has often been tied to gender politics, and this is a part of the story that has received a great deal of attention, but I'd like to know how that story is connected to these conversations about cultural anthropology and about modernist form. How these questions about gender are represented or are connected to both writers' interest in various kinds of art forms. And how do these questions inform debates around modernist aesthetics and politics, of which spatial form and cultural authenticity were such important parts? For that, though, I'm afraid we need to wait until ALA 22, in which I hope we can pick these up in person. Thank you very much.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for coming to this panel and for watching. I want to start by thanking Kelsey Squire for putting this panel together through the Willa Cather Foundation and for inviting me to participate. And thanks to my fellow panelists, Barbara and William, for sharing the virtual space with me. While we're in different places and recording these at different times, I'm glad we are able to come together and share some of our thoughts and experiences as readers of Willa Cather. So my name's Matthew Hitchman. My paper is called Bringing Readers to Regionalism, From Alexander's Bridge to Alexandra's Plains. And I'm going to be talking about those first two novels of Willa Cather. Okay, the differences between Willa Cather's first two novels have long been commented upon. While Cather tried to distance herself from Alexander's Bridge, going as far as to call O Pioneers her true first novel, scholars like Raymond Thorberg, Bernice Sloat, Tom Quirk have offered reassessments for the value of reading Alexander's Bridge. Even Cather's contemporary readers praised the novel upon its publication, drawing comparisons to Henry James and Edith Wharton. This seems to demonstrate to me that while O Pioneers is certainly between the two, it's the work that's much more beloved and remembered by our readers today, this transition from port towns to the prairies was by no means an obvious one for her to have made. So this departure might be understood through discussion of literary traditions. O Pioneers fits within our conception of Cather as a writer of regionalism. Looking at Alexander's Bridge, one is struck by its resemblance to modernist novels of the same period. However, Scott Herring reminds us of the dialogic nature of regionalism, foundational to studies that bridge the mostly artificial divide between elite literary forms, modernism and regionalism. Kelsey Squire also productively flips the term regional modernism to describe Cather as a modern regionalist, emphasizing her position as a regionalist writer who nonetheless engages modernist technique and insists the concerns of a particular geographic region cannot be severed from the metropole. Just as, say, neither can the metropole be fully isolated from the plains. So in this paper, this conversation is kind of what my paper is trying to play a small part in. And I want to suggest that part of this tension that's been commented upon between regionalism and modernism in Cather's work, at least part of it arises through Cather's consideration of her readership. So by taking her readers with her to Nebraska, as it were, Cather worked to incorporate tropes, themes, and even imported settings that would have been familiar from her first novel. In 1931, Cather published in the Colophon an article called My First Two Novels, There Were Two, in which she addresses her choice to move from the metropolitan concerns of Alexander's Bridge to the prairies of Nebraska and O Pioneers. Cather retroactively narrates the difficulty in making this turn to regionalism as a question of readership. As an author, the work of writing is described as an altogether easier process than Alexandra Bridge. She writes, "I found it a much more absorbing occupation, a different process altogether. Here there was no arranging or inventing. Everything was spontaneous and took its own place, right or wrong." So while the writing of a regionalist novel was not a concern for her, she was concerned about the readership. She writes, and this is a famous quote from this passage, "As everyone knows, Nebraska is distinctly déclassé as a literary background. Its very name throws the delicately attuned critic into a clammy shiver of embarrassment. Kansas is almost as uncompromising. Colorado, on the contrary, is considered quite possible. Wyoming really has some class of its own kind, like well-cut riding breeches. But a New York critic voiced a very general opinion when he said, 'I simply don't care a damn what happens in Nebraska, no matter who writes about it,'" end quote. So I think it's important that Cather's phrasing positions the general public and the critic on equal standing. The phrase, "as everyone knows," makes equal the casual reader with that shivering, clammy critic, and both admit that we'd rather not have anything to do with Nebraska if we can help it. So while much of the conversations around Cather's position within regionalism and modernism focuses on the themes of the novels, literary technique used, it's striking to me here that Cather seems unconcerned by those parts of the collision, and that her real worry is, will my readers come with me to Nebraska? So thinking about Alexandra's Bridge, the novel itself received positive reviews at the time. The resonance of Alexandra's Bridge, however, or that resonance certainly had something to do with setting. It was a transatlantic novel. Alexandra vacillates between Boston and London, but its setting also causes it to draw on literary traditions which would have been largely incorporated into literary culture at that point. So thematically, the novel mobilizes some key tropes from the dominant form of maritime fiction, figuring the ocean as a space outside of social constraints, metaphorically pitting Alexander against the cacophony of the oceanic. The first moments where we see this is when Alexander decides to travel across the Atlantic to end his affair with Hilda once and for all. On the day he decides to leave, Alexander spends his time out on the steamer that's on its way to London. He spends his time out on the deck in a rainstorm. At the start, the weather was, quote, "dark and raw. The great open spaces made him passive, and the restlessness of the water quieted him. He intended during the voyage to decide upon a course of action, but he held all this away from him for the present and lay in a blessed gray oblivion. Deep down in him somewhere, his resolution was weakening and strengthening, ebbing and flowing." And again, that evening, we're told, quote, "Alexander came back to the wet deck, piled his damp rugs over him again, and sat smoking, losing himself in the obliterating blackness and drowsing in the rush of the gale." So Cather here is figuring the ocean as a space of dispersal and dissolution. Alexander's experience at sea is one of gray oblivion and obliterating blackness, into which he can eschew his social constraints, such as his marriage, his job responsibilities, and he's able to recuperate his enthusiasm for his affair with Hilda. So Cather's theorization here and description of the ocean rhymes with typical characteristics in sea fiction. William Bollhauer famously writes, "The Atlantic world is fundamentally a space of dispersion, conjunction, distribution, contingency, heterogeneity, and of intersecting and stratified lines and images. In short, a field of strategic possibilities in which the oceanic order holds all together in a common but highly fluid space." So it's within this highly fluid, obliterating field that different aspects of Alexander's life collide and intersect, preventing him from gaining any clarity of reflection. Because of his indecision, this oceanic scene in the novel reoccurs when Alexander's Bridge collapses, and he becomes more than just figuratively obliterated as he drowns with his workers. So in this way, Cather draws on 19th century maritime literary tradition to have her readers follow Alexander's crisis in both his marriage and his career. So that would have been a familiar trope and thematic throughout the novel to readers. While regionalism is often defined as a form of writing in which the setting plays an integral role in the narrative, the geologic, geographic, and institutional specificity of the ocean and the maritime industry clearly are playing an integral role in many modernist novels, which are not associated with regionalism. So to take two examples that predate O Pioneers and Alexander's Bridge, which from the two novelists that were compared to Cather when she wrote Alexander's Bridge, we can see in Henry James's Golden Bowl that there are many Atlantic crossings. Watertight ships are used as an extended metaphor for Maggie and the prince's marriage. The prince imagines he is navigating the white mists of Edgar Allan Poe's Arthur Gordon Pym when he's thinking about the complexity of his relationship with Maggie. Likewise, in Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth, Lily Bart leaves New York to spend time on a yacht in the Mediterranean as a way of fleeing her societal indiscretions, right? And this goes back as far as Charlotte Temple, right, when she faints on the ship that takes her to the colonies. These oceanic crossings and seafarings have served as a way to mediate or bring to crisis narrative threads. So Cather's readers would have recognized this in Alexander's Bridge. And my suggestion is that she continues to draw on and recuperate aspects of maritime writing as a way to specifically reorient her readers to the plains of O Pioneers. So Cather's second novel, which takes place in Nebraska and is a region that would have been less familiar to her readership than Alexander Bridge. It's sort of surprising how many oceanic elements permeate the novel. So, for instance, the characters are often described through watery metaphors. We are told Alexandra's consciousness is, quote, like an underground river that came to the surface only here and there at interval months apart, and then sank again to flow on under her own fields. Nevertheless, the underground stream is there, end quote. Alexandra's mother often seems desperate for her past life in the ports, and she sends her sons to the river to catch fish. Alexandra imagines her mother living on a desert island often. Alexandra's younger brother Emil sings a Swedish song about a ship boy, both throughout Nebraska and his time in Mexico. Marie Shibata imagines herself as a pond during the climax of her character arc, right? She felt as the pond must feel when it held them like that. Her father and grandfather, and this is maybe more importantly maritime, Alexandra's father and grandfather's past in the maritime industry, right? They were both shipbuilders and worked in the ports. It had a clear influence on Alexandra's attachment to maritime culture. At one point, she teaches her niece a book of songs that John Bergson used to sing. And she tells her niece, I used to remember hearing him sing with the sailors down in the shipyard. She's memorized many sea narratives. She reads the Swiss Family Robinson, right? Her father taught her speculation and the ability to sort of think about speculation in the marketplace through his experiences in the maritime industry, and she's able to apply that to the Nebraska plains. On her father's deathbed, right, Carl projects scenes of Robinson Crusoe on their walls, and as he's dying, as the father's dying, he calls out, daughter, end quote. His daughter came and lifted him on his pillows. She called him by an old Swedish name that she used to call him when she was little and took his dinner to him in the shipyard. Additionally, to sort of further establish this, when Alexandra looks at the land, speculating on its value, it often gets rendered as water, as, quote, brown waves of earth. At one point, Alexandra encourages Emile to ask old Ivor about that big pond. And Ivor says, yes, quote, a big white bird with long wings and pink feet flew over the pond. She was going over to the other ocean maybe, and did not know how far it was. Maybe she thought my house was a boat. She was such a wild thing, end quote. In the bird's attempt to travel to the Atlantic Ocean, to the Pacific, the way the seagull mistakes Ivor's dwelling for a ship effectively inverts the land-water opposition momentarily, and we are made to imagine this vast prairie as an ocean. Further, having made her decision to not move down to the river farms, perhaps the most crucial decision she makes in the novel, Neale looks at Alexandra's happy face, and we're told, quote, for the first time, perhaps, since that land emerged from the waters of geologic ages, a human face was set towards it with love and yearning. It seemed beautiful to her, rich and strong and glorious. Her eyes drank in the breadth of it until her tears blinded her, end quote. So in this description, the landscape of Nebraska wavers between land and water twice. We're first made to imagine the prairies emerging out of the ocean. And then once the land itself is solid and strong, we see it again through Alexandra's teary eyes, and the vision of the land becomes immersed in a second type of salt water. Through these liquefations of the land, Cather draws her readers into this region and attempts to have the settings function similarly to the Atlantic crossings of her first novel. And I also think of this, the final scene when, her and Carl decide to get married, and she says, I haven't been on the water since we crossed the ocean. It sort of ends with them dreaming about going out to sea. Right? Okay, so these aspects of the novel, O Pioneers, I argue, draw on traditions of maritime writing that were at this point mostly residual cultural forms incorporated into realist, naturalist, and modernist writing in the US. By drawing on such aspects in her first properly regionalist novel, Cather made the landscape familiar. But beyond merely making it familiar for her readers, in order to tell the story Cather says she wanted to tell, this importation of literary tradition brings with it many of the aspects that blur the distinctions between O Pioneer's regionalism and modernist concerns, such as empire, marketplaces, and transnational colonial projects. I want to close with just a few reflections on the potential analysis that gets opened up by reading Cather's regionalism in this way. By bringing her readers to regionalism through drawing on maritime tropes, there are a handful of discourses that she brings with them, or with her in this novel. So while the novel is about a specific family living on a specific tract of land, the period surrounding the novel, the historical period, saw national and global shifts in political economy, expansionist projects of American empire, a surge in populist movements, and reconfigurations of racial capitalism that underwrote the colonization of the American West. During the 1880s, the maritime industry saw an intense effort to produce new battleships, making the dawn of America's new Navy. And then 1890s saw an increased colonial efforts in Latin America and the Pacific. So these overseas expansionist projects were mirrored by territorial expansion in the US mainland as genocidal Indian wars continued throughout the turn of the 20th century. So these historical circumstances, right, these broader historical trends were playing themselves out in specific aspects of O Pioneers. And they come to light in moments where she confounds the prairie with the ocean. Right? So these moments when the prairie seems like the ocean and it's not clear, the narrative invites a comparison between the logics of displacement and colonialism, which were the precondition of Alexandra's land prospecting, and the imperial logic of American empire building in Nicaragua, Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, the Hawaiian Islands, and elsewhere that were happening at the same time. As Nikhil Paul Singh illustrates, the colonization of the American West was often invoked and is still invoked in American war making as a justification of American imperial projects, He notes that Theodore Roosevelt, who assumed office at the same time the novel takes place, quote, mocked the anti-imperialists of his day who opposed US counterinsurgency wars in the Philippines and Cuba as sentimentalists who would give Arizona back to the Apaches. And Singh also writes, quote, metaphors of Indian country routinely emerge in rhetoric of US militarism overseas, from the Philippines at the start of the 20th century, the Pacific battlefields of World War II, to Vietnam and the Cold War, and Afghanistan and Iraq today. What Singh is saying here is that while the ongoing history of colonization, which surrounds Cather's novel, is used as a justification and logic for overseas imperial projects, the novel seems to illustrate how this connection is backward-reaching as well. And Cather's situation as a settler colonist draws on a sensibility emerging out of turn-of-the-century maritime industry. So by drawing on these tropes as a way to make familiar the plains of Nebraska, she sort of brings with it this linkage between the discourses of American empire, both overseas and territorial. Finally, these dynamics lead to more modernist reflections on financial speculation as well. So alongside the Indian Wars, Wall Street bankers would swoop in to places where indigenous people had been displaced and attempt to reap profits off the indebtedness of agrarian farmers and colonists, as well as the unpaid feminized labor of such projects. So, and this speculative know-how that Alexandra has, right, which if we remember, she learned through her father's time in the shipping industry. Sorry, let me back up. These Wall Street bankers tried to reap profits off the indebtedness of agrarian farmers, right? And this shows up in Opiners as well. When Alexandra uses her sort of skills of speculation and management of the farm, which she learned from her father's time in the shipping industry, her brother Lou is worried about this indebtedness, and he can't recognize her labor as actual labor. He only recognizes physical farm work as labor. Alexandra insists that her work in market speculation and the effective labor of maintaining relationships with those in town has generated the majority of their wealth. Despite her argument, Lou and Oscar insist that, quote, good advice is all right, but it don't get the weeds out of the corn. And they say of Alexandra that if she tells you to put a crop, she thinks she put it in. So they understand that they're being taken advantage of by the financiers on Wall Street, but they place the blame on newcomers to capital, like women and immigrants. So by attending to the expectations of her readers, I believe Cather imported aspects of a tradition in maritime writing, which we might at least partially credit with her negation of regionalism, or negotiation of regionalism and modernism. Such an incorporation brought with it, however, inadvertently, discourses on American empire, financialization, and colonialism. In the works of Cather, I believe we are able to see how such discourses shape the conditions for her regionalism, but which also allow us to think through ways farmers like Alexandra might have negotiated, accepted, as well as resisted such discourses. Thanks.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Kelsey, for organizing this panel, which is allowing me to share the Slow Read project and the feedback I received from those who participated by reading Willa Cather's My Ántonia in small increments over the course of a summer. I'm especially excited to present this project to the ALA community of literary scholars. I do wish that we could be in person in order to continue the conversations that each of these presentations inspire. I'll start by explaining the Slow Read and why I felt motivated to create such a complicated project, and then move into the reactions that I collected from those who participated. The Slow Read was a public literary art project created to honor the centenary publication of My Ántonia in 2018. A website, slowread.org, was designed and engineered to simulcast 3-page spreads or 6 pages, each day over the course of that summer. The Slow Read website contains high-quality scans of the first edition of My Ántonia, generously created by UNL's library at the request of Andy Jewell. That summer, starting on May 30th, the first 6 pages of My Ántonia were made available to readers. On May 31st, the next 6 pages were made available. If you were diligent, you followed along each day throughout the summer, reading only as far as the pages allowed. Each day's reading was archived on the website, so you could always go back and read what you missed, but you couldn't jump forward. This is what you saw if you were reading on a laptop. Today's date was indicated, and the page numbers from the original novel were highlighted so that you would know which page spread you were on during the website-controlled rotation. So here's the first spread for July 29th. We're starting with the second chapter of the section called The Pioneer Woman's Story. After 2 minutes, the second spread appears. And after another 2 minutes, the third. At the end of the 3-page spreads, a project information page was displayed, inviting readers to explore other parts of the website. And after 2 minutes, you'd be brought back to the title page before the rotation of pages began again. If you were on your own device, you could explore the website where you would discover a visual concordance of artwork that I created over an 8-year period in response to this novel. Also, Project News was a blog that I kept to offer my own observations, alert folks to other events connected to the centenary, and announce locations where I might be projecting the pages outdoors. The Slow Read could be accessed on personal laptop computers, on iPads and smartphones, though these devices limited the display to 1 page at a time. Here's the smartphone version. I didn't tie this project to an audio version as I wanted to focus on the novel's physical publication 100 years earlier. Fortunately, there are many audio versions available through public libraries to those who want to listen to the book. I highly recommend George Guidel's reading. I found 11 locations around the U.S. to run the Slow Read on public-facing monitors. This allowed the unsuspecting passersby to discover the project. In Nebraska, there were 6 public monitors, 2 of which were hosted at the Cather Foundation in Red Cloud. 1 at Constellation Studios in Lincoln, which coincidentally was also a Pokemon Go site, and at the Love Library at UNL, and also at Union College in Lincoln, and at the Chris Library at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Other public monitors were located in Jaffrey, New York, and around the city of Portland, Oregon, where I live. I also traveled that summer with a video projector and found a few locations that I could run the project as a pop-up outdoor event. Here in Salt Lake City, the audience asked if they could take turns reading the passages out loud. And here's an evening in Boulder, Colorado. And there were some who read the daily segments from their own copies of the novel, as my German friend Peter Malutsky did, proudly sending me a photo as proof. He writes that his copy has the same layout as the first edition, making it easy to follow along. So what motivated me to create the Slow Read? After creating 8 years of artwork around this one novel, I really could not ignore its 100-year anniversary. I was also curious to create a unique reading experience that would dovetail with other celebrations happening worldwide. I was charmed by the idea that the simple act of reading could become a kind of public spectacle. And I was also just curious about what it meant to read something slowly as a daily practice and in community. To give you some background, I'll show a few of the art projects that I've created around this novel. All of these are documented on the Slow Read website if you want to take a closer look. The first project was in 2010, an installation at Reed College titled A Close Read. The concept for this exhibition was to put myself in the position of a first-time reader and use the space of the gallery to map out the emerging understanding of the story as I listened to it on an audiobook read by George Guidel. I chose My Ántonia somewhat randomly for this project, partly because I knew it was a book I should read someday. I started with assigning each character a color of tape and began mapping out the story as I personally understood it. The tape allowed me to make edits and write notes of where we were in the story. The end result covered the entire gallery floor and reminded one of a subway map. I also worked with the walls and overhead space in the gallery, using them to position excerpts from the novel that I had become obsessed with. Remember that this was my first time reading Cather. I could not believe how seductive her descriptions were, especially of the sky and landscape. Her writing took over any desire on my part to create images in the gallery. Instead, my sole desire was that visitors would stop and read Cather's words. This project was one of the strangest and most vulnerable projects I'd ever undertaken. The end result was something I didn't even recognize as my own work, even an art project at all. But it's often one's audience that can show you the value of your commitment and trust. A Reed College professor who teaches Cather said that this project showed and explained things to her that her own literary community had not. So from that initial project came invitations to explore this in other venues and formats. An artist book and a map came next. I used the colored tape from the floor of the Reed project as inspiration for a large folded map. This is the 18 by 24 etching printed on Japanese paper with letterpress text. Like the floor in the gallery, it represents how I understood the narrative. An accompanying book used the hanging texts in the gallery as inspiration for the placement of page and texts. You could say that this project brought the Reed College installation back into book form. 2 more gallery installations followed this book, one in the gallery at the college I was teaching at, Oregon College of Art and Craft, and the other in Lincoln, Nebraska at Constellation Studios. The second installation had me thinking about orientation devices and signage that, like text in a novel, invite the reader to use their imagination to see. At OCAC, visitors first encountered a viewing platform set in the balcony, overlooking the gallery to get an overview of the novel. The board was divided into the 5 books in the novel, contained lines of sight burned into the wood, and hand-printed texts indicating key moments in the novel. Cather's story was mapped out with painted lines and text on the gallery floor and walls. So visitors entered the space of the novel once they came down into the main gallery. They could wander over the map, chart a character's path, and read small excerpts as they became physically entwined in the story. Constellation Studios in Lincoln was established by my colleague Karen Kuntz, who thought it was important that I create a project in Nebraska, and so offered me her gallery space. The building was perfect in every way. For this version, I used vinyl signage and tape, and tried to bring a sense of emotion by using wool and other natural materials. Numbers were positioned on the floors and walls. Each number corresponded to an excerpt from the novel, so each visitor was led around the gallery by this printed guide. Here are some details from that installation. And all of this led me to create the slow read. This project came to me after I had taken a short workshop on video projection mapping. Video mapping is often used in large spectacles, like the opening ceremony for the Olympics and Cirque du Soleil productions. The idea of projecting images onto buildings outdoors was intriguing, but I found it hard to imagine what I, a book artist, would do with this kind of opportunity and technology. But then I thought, wouldn't it be funny to project a page of text that had to be read in order to experience something exciting? And what if the video program controlled a turning of pages so an entire book could be read in public? And what if this required or rewarded the reader to return each day as a kind of pilgrimage to experience the totality of the novel? And then it dawned on me that the 100-year anniversary of my Ántonia was approaching in 3 years, and if I got my act together, I might bring this projection idea to life through Cather's novel. When I shared this idea with Cather organizations, it was clear that one site was too limited, so the website-driven simulcast idea was born. It took 3 years of organization and grant writing to see this come to life. So now I'll share some of the feedback that I received from people who followed the novel through the slow read. Through SurveyMonkey, I was able to create questions and collect some basic data, such as if this was the first time they read my Ántonia. And you can see that for over half of them, it was not the first time. Here I was asking how they accessed the slow read, and you can see that most followed along on their laptops, though some on their smartphones. The nature of life and summers can make it difficult to keep up with a daily ritual, so only about 15% of the respondees stuck with it each day, but 30% did a fair amount of reading. I was able to ask some direct questions to get written responses from, and so I asked if the slow read provided a deeper or new understanding of the novel. I received some wonderful comments here. Here are some excerpts from what people wrote. One woman wrote, I had heard of my Ántonia because it was on a suggested reading list in high school. I had never opened the book until the slow read, and I'm so glad this was my first exposure to this beautiful story. I was able to savor the gorgeous imagery a few pages at a time. This made it easier to ponder a character, consider a scene, or wonder what might happen next. The piecemeal servings made me anticipate each section more than if I had read the whole book in one sitting. It almost felt as though the tale was happening in real time. I became very attached to the people and felt immersed in that era. Another person wrote, I think I probably related the book to current events now, much more than I might have in my much earlier reading. Another said, reading it slowly allowed for more reflection, and actually this was repeated often in the comments. Another person said, this time through I noticed I read less for plot, though its story has always compelled me. Going slowly, I experienced its details, a little like the difference between going from point A to point B in a car versus taking the same route on foot. I also received emails directly from readers. Here's one that gave me instant relief. I've been a longtime Cather enthusiast since I began reading her about 20 years ago, and my Ántonia has always been one of my favorites. Making the project participatory and public-facing seems an inspired next step in your process. And as you've already noted, so many of the themes are still so relevant today. I'm loving the ritual of reading along each morning, knowing that there are others in the world doing the same. It's a wonderful way to begin the day. There's always a sense of anticipation about what the next day will bring, as readings often stop mid-sentence. I could, of course, go to my print edition of my Ántonia to solve daily mysteries about what's next, but I don't want to spoil the daily community ritual of reading the assigned pages, so I wait patiently for the next day's revelations. I find that I'm falling in love all over again with my Ántonia. Thank you for this project. Another email pondered the 6-page quota. Dear Barb, thanks so much for the prompt. I thought I was too busy for this, but I decided to give it a try. I started this morning, and of course I immediately got drawn in. I made it through June 13th today, and I expect to catch up with the rest of you soon so I can join you at the slow read pace for the remainder of the summer. My grandmother recommended my Ántonia to me years ago, and it's easy to see why as I read it now. I'm curious if others have commented on the rhythm of the 6-page daily quota. I have the oddest feeling of suspension when I find my click has taken me back to the first page of the day instead of onto the next. There I am, mid-sentence or even mid-word, fully anticipating the thread to continue spooling. Instead, it abruptly pulls me back 6 pages. My sense of anticipation is replaced by a feeling of comfort and familiarity when I realize I'm now rereading words I encountered just moments before. The feeling is unlike anything I've ever gotten from reading before, and even after I repeated the scenario multiple times today, it still catches my breath. It's almost a feeling of lightheadedness, quite lovely and addicting. I look forward to seeing how it changes when it happens only once a day, and I have to wait until the next day to continue. For myself, reading the novel as I drove across the Midwest that summer brought serendipitous connections between the novel and actual life. For instance, after leaving Red Cloud, I detoured to find coffee in Lexington, Nebraska. The town, because of a meatpacking plant nearby, has become about 50% Hispanic and 30% Somali. 100 years later, Cather's story of immigrants trying to find a foothold in the U.S. is played out in these small towns. As someone who had read this novel over and over again for 8 years, the limited daily pages made clear that there were parts of the novel I had completely failed to read. Some days it seemed like somebody was playing a trick on me, inserting whole passages I couldn't recall having ever read. It made me understand that a novel is always a relationship between an author and a reader, and then again, ever dependent on where the reader is in their life. I'll end here and invite any of you who are curious to experience the slow read to go to this website, where it's accessible as a numbered sequence. It's up to you to keep track of the readings in that order and to click on the next one each day. I recommend inviting others to join you so you can discuss Cather's words and share the connections that are revealed between her story and your life. Thank you.
I hope that you enjoyed listening to our 3 papers today. As I listened to these scholars, one common question that came to my mind was, how do communities shape what is valued in reading practices? I really see connections, for example, between William's discussion of anthropology and Matt's discussion of maritime fiction, both of which can be connected to some larger social and cultural movements. I really appreciate how Matt reads Cather's work in light of settler colonialism and imperialism, and I can see Cather's studies delving more deeply into these topics in the next few years. These changes to the landscape and communities in the United States, I think, also resonated with Barb's interest in attempting to physically map my Ántonia. I was also really fascinated with William's reading of Cather alongside Zora Neale Hurston, and it made me curious to think about some of the similarities that we see across the reception of their works. In turning to Barb's paper, I think that she really brings community reading into a very literal practice. Her project made me consider how we often view reading as a very solitary activity, and it made me stop and think about other forms of reading communities, such as book clubs or online forums like Google Reads. These communities, however, seem to focus more on getting to the end of the book in order to talk about it, whereas Barb's project really celebrated slower and more contemplative forms of reading. I want to thank William, Matthew, and Barb for sharing their thought-provoking projects with us today. If you're interested in exploring the life and career of Willa Cather, you can find out more information about upcoming conferences and events at the Willa Cather Foundation's website by visiting www.willacather.org. The Cather Project at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln also has several social media channels and our listserv, which is called Number 5 Bank Street, where you can also connect with other Cather scholars and find information about conferences, events, and new research. We have 2 Cather panels this year at ALA, and I hope that you will check out our other panel on Willa Cather and the 1920s. There's a lot of interesting synergy between these 2 panels, especially concerning topics like Cather's connections to anthropology, the culture of the 1920s, and even her relationship to time that I hope that you'll appreciate. Thanks for watching, everybody.